This lecture is going to discuss states. While we might think of the United States as having states, in the sense of Pennsylvania or North Dakota or California, that's not exactly the type of state we're going to be talking about. In political science parlance, states are what we might colloquially call countries. So states are United States, Canada, the UK, France, Nigeria. And today, centralized authority occurs through states in the international system and throughout the world. But for most of history, politics was built on something other than states. And we will get to that when we're talking about the emergence of states a little bit later in this lecture. But first, let's define what exactly a state is, because the term country actually has a slightly different terminology than what we use in everyday speech. So for a state, we can look to the political philosopher Max Weber. I guess he was a sociologist. But Max Weber, his definition is pretty much the definition we go by today. It is an organization that maintains a monopoly of violence over a territory. And when we're talking about states, it is often common to discuss another term, sovereignty. Sovereignty is the ability to carry out actions and policies within a territory independent of external actors and internal rivals. So a sovereignty is kind of a quality that states enjoy. And we'll discuss later that they picked up this idea of sovereignty back in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. But that's neither here nor there right now. The long and short of it is that a state needs power to be the primary authority over its territory and people. Otherwise, rivals may compete and undermine policies that it seeks to enact. There could be organized crime, or there could be rebels within the territory seeking to stake out some territory and demand respect. So therefore, a state must be armed. We see a police force in virtually every state. Sometimes that police force is used efficiently and effectively. Other times it's used quite harshly. States also need to protect internationally from rivals outside of the territory. Therefore, another form of a police force is kind of an international police force that we call an army or a navy or, in the United States, a Marine Corps, or Air Force. Including all of these aforementioned functions, a state is a set of institutions seeking to wield the most force in a territory, establishing order and deterring domestic and international challengers. In other words, it's kind of a racket. It demands money in return for relative security and order. It goes about staking out turf and claims the people on that turf, settling internal disputes, punishing people who fail to, appreciate the wonderful things that the state does for them through taxation and loyalty. So modern states are a little bit more complex than this kind of simple racket that I just mentioned. They also embody a set of institutions that the society within the state deems necessary to achieve certain things. The public largely views the state as legitimate. And through this legitimacy, as we'll talk about soon enough here, this state is strongly institutionalized. Therefore, it is not easily changed. It has a certain institutional stickiness. So we talked about a state. Let's distinguish state from what we might call a regime. Sometimes we use the word regime to talk about some sort of dictatorship or describing maybe a military coup d'etat, or it's usually used in that kind of theme. But a regime has a really particular definition within political science, and a regime is the fundamental rules and norms of politics. A regime embodies long-term goals that guide the state, specifically regarding things like individual freedom versus collective equality. It outlines who should have power and discusses how that power should be used. So it's kind of the overarching theme, or it's tied to the political culture that runs, that kind of exists to keep the state going. When we talk about regime, we can often describe a regime, for instance, as either democratic or non-democratic. In a democratic regime, there are rules and norms of politics that give the public a large role in governance. In non-democratic regimes, there are largely limits to how much the public can participate in governance. And these differences can be found in basic documents like constitutions, or they can be informal or unwritten or implicit within the political culture itself. So we talked about a state, we talked about a regime. Then here's another tough term that we need to wrap our heads around: government. All right, so often we use a state or a government kind of simultaneously or synonymously, but they are indeed different things. A government is the leadership that runs the state. This involves elected legislatures, like legislators or presidents or prime ministers, but they could also mean the leaders who were there by force, the dictators, or the people who are appointed there just because you're a brother's cousin of my next door neighbor or something like that. So the government, as being, again, the leadership that runs the state, uses the state to try to achieve certain goals. And again, let's return to the goals related to freedom and equality. However, few governments have complete autonomy. They have to deal, in one sense, with the existing regime in place. So it's difficult to push against the norms and practices that exist and the expectations that the people in the country have regarding what the government can and can't do. So it's difficult to push against it. So there could be resistance or rebellion, or it could even collapse if the government pushes too hard against the existing regime. For example, Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s implemented reforms of glasnost and perestroika, which ultimately spelled disaster and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because regimes have power, governments then themselves tend to be weakly institutionalized. The public tends to view leadership as largely replaceable. So if we're looking at things that are pretty institutionalized to things that are relatively uninstitutionalized, of these terms that we just spoke about, we can think of the state as being very institutionalized, a regime being kind of institutionalized, and the government itself being less institutionalized. And I have here a nice little layout of comparison between a state, a regime, and a government. So let's review a little bit. So the state, we can look at characteristics of a state. A state has the monopoly of force over a given territory. It embodies a set of political institutions that generate and carry out policy. It is sovereign, so it enjoys this sovereignty that you can't do, and no one can do anything else within my borders except for me, the state. And it's highly institutionalized. It has an army, a police, taxation, judiciary, all that are institutionalized to protect the state and give the state legitimacy. A regime. A regime embodies norms and rules regarding individual freedom, collective equality, the locus of power, and how to use that power. A regime is pretty institutionalized. However, it can be changed by dramatic social events like revolution. At the basic level, a regime can be characterized as either democratic or undemocratic, non-democratic, or even authoritarian, which you can use synonymously here. And a regime its characteristics, at least, can be described in a constitution or informal rules and norms of the society. A government, here, lastly, is the leadership or elite in charge of running the state. Of these three terms, it is, and in institutions, it is the least institutionalized. It is limited by the existing regime in place and is composed of elected officials, a president or a prime minister or legislators, or even unelected officials like a monarch or a dictator. So again, we can look at most institutionalized to less, the state, the regime, and then the government. So there's one cool little term that we didn't talk about yet that I said we would, and that is a country. So what is a country? Well, a country is a combination of all those three. It is the combined political identities of state, regime, and government. So now that we are just full of these delicious terms, let's move on to how they came into existence in the first place, particularly the state. Let's look at the origins of political organization. So much of what we know about early political organization is from archaeology, historical works, and largely conjecture from this evidence that we get through the studies of those things. In the early stages and early on, people were organized by families and tribes. There were modern populations outside of Africa that quickly migrated outward less than 100,000 years ago. I know that's a huge, long time ago, considering today, but, if you think there was only 2,000 years since the time of Christ. But so, 100,000 years ago, people rapidly moved outward from Africa. There were subgroups from those groups who migrated and traveled by sea, and then they passed on knowledge from generation to generation about social organization. So let's fast forward a little bit. By 8,000 BC, yes, I know today we use the BC and CE, but I'm going to use BC for the terminology just because, that's what I grew up on. So by 8,000 BC, agriculture was a staple of civilization, and animal domestication was figured out in the Middle East. And from there, more complex civilization and political systems arose. Cut that in half, around 4,000 BC, there were cities of a few thousand that popped up. And they were made possible by specialization of trade of labor. And through that came consumer goods and trade, and increased population density. And as human civilization was able to gain a sort of relative comfort, then they began thinking about these issues of inequality and personal freedom. It is conjecture, hypothesized, that innovations like technology and increased trade and modern agricultural innovations that probably led to the first conflict between the individual and the collective. Questions like who gets what and who has the right to do what began to pop up. Now, how political authority came into being is, again, largely up to people's imagination. And we'll talk about two of those people right now that we talked about in the last lecture, the first being Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes thought that humans voluntarily submitted to political authority originally for security, and in return, people gave up many of their rights in return for that security. Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought that humans in the state of nature were naturally compassionate and egalitarian. They were, quote, noble savages. It was civilization, that he thought, and the rise of the state that corrupted humans by institutionalizing a system of inequality. Both Hobbes and Rousseau emphasized this social contract between the state and the people. So complex organizations arose around 6000 BC in the Middle East. Some political units were pretty small. Others were pretty large, those small ones being those city-states that arose in Greece, maybe around 500 or 300 BC. These large political units being empires that emerged in China, South America, Middle East, and Africa, relatively at the same time. And this was between right around 800 to 1200 AD, or in other parlance, CE, the Common Era. However, these empires didn't really exist as the modern state does. There were blurred borders, and the chain of powers and legitimacy were kind of skewed, so they aren't considered to be really modern states. Although the Chinese Empire became pretty close through natural geographic boundaries. Eventually, the modern state did emerge, and it took root in Europe. Well, why in Europe? Well, we're not really sure. However, we do have kind of a good explanation for why the modern state emerged in Europe. So, at around the time of Christ, Europe was dominated by a single large empire, and this empire was called the Roman Empire. Well, the Roman Empire, as many people know, collapsed. And with that, the collapse of the Roman Empire came the erosion of people's security and infrastructure and norms and the technology that they had enjoyed. So all these things kind of disappeared. And their elaborate system of trade that had existed in the Roman Empire disappeared as well. So between 500 and 1000 AD, this time period is largely called the Dark Ages. And Europe was largely anarchic in this time. And colloquially, we think of the term anarchy to mean disorder, but I'm going to use it in the literal term meaning without rulers or without government. So it was largely anarchic during this time. And that maybe or maybe not has to do with the lack or their kind of poverty may or may not have to do with their lack of central authority. So I would not correlate those two, but it does speak to kind of their social institutions and how they were eroded after the fall of the Roman Empire. However, they were in a destitute manner for a good 500 years or so. Scholar, sociologist Charles Tilly said that this time period and the setting during the Dark Ages was fertile for the creation of the modern state. Things were fragmented, unstable, and violent. Political organizations emerged eventually, controlling and taxing the people. There were warlords who staked out swaths of land and consolidated control. And the modern state emerged from these organized crime bands. There were armed groups, like we said before. They staked out turf. They offered protection and demanded payment in return in the form of taxes. Now, in Europe specifically, geography helped. Europe had a close proximity, relatively speaking, to the Middle East and to Asia, which offered new plants and animals, as well as technological innovations. So you might think, why, if China had a large empire to begin with and has this long history, why didn't the modern state pop up in China? Well, we have, maybe a cool answer for that as well. There was an absence of geographic boundaries like that split and divide Europe. So there weren't as many major neighboring political rivals. Also, China had political centralization early, and so this sort of disorganization and fragility that Europe experienced during the Dark Ages wasn't as pronounced, you could say, in China if it happened at all. So in contrast, Europe had this ethnic and linguistic fragmentation. There were rival actors. There were geographic boundaries in the forms of mountains and rivers and, your typical land masses that we learn in elementary school. These boundaries hindered the creation of a single European state early on, as had happened in China. So this modern state arose out of the Dark Ages in Europe. Now, the state we can think of as largely having three advantages over other, maybe alternative forms of political organization. The first, states encouraged economic development. Particularly in Europe, rulers created laws, regulations, and infrastructure. They relatively respected private property and individual profit. And the reason they did that, because they figured out, well, if we respect individual profit, we can allow production to grow, and then we can actually tax those profits. Take that money and then spend it on militaries to make war, and then to expand the empire or their own large centralized states that way. Number two, states encouraged technological innovation, which is kind of related to the first one. States used that innovation to expand its own power and influence, using things like gunpowder and advanced mathematics, modern map making, paper, and astronomy. These discoveries were encouraged and then used by the state for its own purposes. And number three, domestic stability. The state increased trade and commerce. It allowed for the development of infrastructure so people could travel more freely, and because people traveled more freely through this infrastructure, a shared identity emerged. And so this idea of ethnicity took root. And the idea of ethnicity was a hugely powerful asset for the state because the state can use nationalism for its own purposes, in war making and in consolidating power. But by 1500, the year 1500, still only 20% of the globe was full of modern states. This changed very quickly. So even though the modern state took a long time to develop, its spread occurred quite quickly. Innovations, economic resources, and national identity gave European states the means to accrue power. There were modern major militaries that had existed and formed, and these militaries absorbed their smaller and weaker European rivals. The 30 Years' War in the 1600s was a crucial war, primarily, at least when we're talking about international relations and comparative politics, because of how it ended. It was largely a religious war, but also involved the nation-states of Europe. And the 30 Years' War ended in the Treaty or Peace of Westphalia in 1648. And 1648 is typically when we use as a marker as the beginning of the modern nation-state. The modern state, we can say. And why was that? Well, through the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the authority of the Pope was severely curtailed. And, maybe more importantly, the idea of state sovereignty took root. Afterwards, European states began looking outward. In the 1600s and the 1700s, Spain and Portugal took parts of the Americas. The Dutch, the French, and the British took parts of Asia. And by 1800, most of Africa divided among European states. Thus, the structure of the state was exported by force to the rest of the world. States multiplied, and eventually people threw off European domination and colonialism, sometimes not until the 1960s, but the states stuck. But because of colonialism and other shortcomings, just as a result of geography and history, some of these states did not and have not fared well since then. But the world became an international system of states, with borders and rules and norms and sovereignty, oh my. So the states became the primary actors on the global scene. So again, it took hundreds of years for states to emerge in Europe, but it did not take very long for the state system to spread quickly throughout the world. Its institutions stuck, but the historical paths of states largely took different forms around the world. So, for instance, in Asia and Africa and South America, the newer states largely had not very sticky institutions in the forms of their national identities, in the physical infrastructure, in natural resources, or capital accumulation. So even today, they still face significant challenges that most European states have long overcome. So we can think of states like in sub-Saharan Africa and lesser developed countries in South America, as well as Asia. So let's compare state power. Again, this course is comparative, right? We're comparing things. Yay. Very fun. So let's compare power. And we can think of power in a few different ways. This idea of the state is the same everywhere. But again, they are not the same throughout the world. Some are powerful, some are prosperous, some are stable, and others are weak, disorganized, and relatively ineffective in carrying out their duties. Some are effective in one area and completely incompetent in others. One example of this is Pakistan. Pakistan is able to build nuclear weapons, and for that matter, North Korea is as well. And neither of these countries can keep the lights on. They have poor power grids and poor infrastructure. The first way we can measure state power is through legitimacy. Legitimacy, the big L word, right? Legitimacy is something or someone who is recognized and accepted as right and proper. That seems pretty vague. However, if you think about just talking about, that's illegitimate. That's an illegitimate child. Well, I guess it doesn't really apply. But if we think about just using it colloquially in everyday parlance, and we're thinking about how we use it, we're basically saying, that's just not right. Right? So it's kind of the best we can do as far as a definition. Something or someone is recognized and accepted as right and proper. Something that is legitimate is widely accepted and recognized by the public. It confers authority and power. It creates power that relies not simply on coercion, but on consent. So think about that more deeply. Legitimacy in the state comes from consent, ultimately. So even though I might sit here as an anarcho-libertarian thinking, man, I really hate the state, there's a whole 330 million other people within the country that legitimize the state because they consent to it, not simply because it's forced upon them. And we'll get to why force isn't it's a necessary but not sufficient explanation for why the state exists. Without legitimacy, a state would have to use the continuous threat of force to maintain order. Again, it's very difficult. Very difficult to do for long periods of time, and for you to keep your position of power and even your life if you are the head of the government. Legitimacy is critical to what we might call stateness, the quality of being a state, I suppose. So how do states generate this legitimacy? How do they become legitimate? Well, here, let's return back to our favorite German. I think it was German. Yeah, Austrian. I don't know. Max Weber. Max Weber said that political legitimacy comes in three basic forms, which can be overlapping. We'll get to that in a second. These three basic forms are traditional legitimacy, charismatic legitimacy, and rational legal legitimacy. So let's dive right in. Traditional legitimacy, we can think of, and as a shorthand, as being Things within the state exist, or the state exists, simply because it has always been that way. There are traditions or things within the state that build over a long period of time that legitimize the state. This can be embodied in the historical identity of the people themselves. Traditional legitimacy also embodies historical myths and legends through rituals and ceremonies, for example, a long-standing monarchy. The traditional legitimacy relies on this continuity between past and present. So its traditional legitimacy is built on history and continuity. Therefore, change within a traditional state is difficult because, in other words, it has always been that way. So traditional institutions, or institutions within traditional legitimate states, have sticky institutions. 2. Charismatic legitimacy. Think of charismatic as being charisma. Who has charisma? James Bond has charisma. Well, what does that mean? He's able to persuade people very easily. He's got a way about him, a je ne sais quoi. Who else has charisma? Or had charisma? Jesus had charisma. He had a way of he had a certain magnetism to him, right? So therefore, charismatic legitimacy is based on the power of ideas or beliefs. It's often based on individuals who can move and persuade the public through ideas and in the manner in which they are presented. Some of these individuals, like Jesus or Mohammed, or, funny that I'm putting them in this group, but Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, these were people who were very charismatic and had this sort of a cult of personality around them. They were able to persuade others into really latching on to what they had to say and their ideas. Now, one important aspect of charismatic legitimacy is that it's not very institutionalized. It is brittle, it is tenuous, and the legitimacy that comes with these individuals or these specific ideas, maybe like populism, commonly dies with the individual who possesses this charismatic legitimacy. However, charismatic legitimacy I know we're talking about theory, is kind of like theoretical right now, but bear with me here. Charismatic legitimacy can be transformed into traditional legitimacy through the creation of rituals and values meant to capture the spirit of the charismatic leader's power. So if there's some sort of ritual or thing that charismatic leader did that after that leader died, you might want to keep doing as a way of continuing that legitimacy, maybe, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but things like religious rituals or monarchical ceremonies or constitutions are a way of transferring this charismatic legitimacy to traditional legitimacy. And Max Weber called this, quote unquote, the routinization of charisma. The third type of legitimacy is rational legal legitimacy. And this is what modern states are and modern democracies are based on today, largely. The rational legal legitimacy is based on a system of laws and procedures that are presumed to be neutral or rational. Within this type of legitimacy, in states that embody this legitimacy, leaders and politicians have legitimacy not in themselves and in their persons, but through the system of laws and procedures through which they came to office. So there's more of a respect for the positions in the office, not necessarily the leaders themselves. So people obey the decisions of those in power because they abide by the institutionalized rules. So once these leaders in these offices leave office, they lose much of their authority. So you can think of like modern presidents in the United States. You think about like Barack Obama. All right, he has a lot of authority, got a lot of money still, but not as much as he did whenever he was in power. Modern states are also built on a rational legal foundation. There are institutions like bureaucracies, there's paperwork, there's procedures for doing things, because this is widely believed to be the proper way to get things done. And it is reasonably fair and predictable the way things are done. There are elections, and the way we know that there is a good, solid, rational, legal legitimacy in a state is when not necessarily there are elections, but when, after those elections, the people who are on the losing side accept the outcome of those elections. It's important to note as well that states do have a mixture of all three forms of legitimacy. Charismatic legitimacy is often revolving around so-called cults of personality. Maybe there's a leader in a country who is seen as the father of a country. Well, that could be good or bad. George Washington in the United States. But a more severe example is in North Korea with the Kim family. In India, back when India won its independence, Mahatma Gandhi. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela. These are all, seem to be alluded to be the fathers of the countries. Within traditional legitimacy, there are monarchs, there are political families, there are rules and regulations that exist that take the form of just kind of the sacred way of doing things. In the UK, in Japan, and Saudi Arabia, there are monarchs, and 40 some other countries. However, these monarchs have limited powers, but they are still important symbols for the legitimacy of the state. In India, the political family of Indira Gandhi, who was prime minister for 15 years, then gave the power away to, not literally, but through the elections, but still through this legitimacy. Her son, Rajiv, became prime minister, and then his wife, Sonia, became prime minister. Their son, Rahul, was raised to take up the cause. However, he wasn't very charismatic. However, that is a good example of a political family. You might think of like the Cuomos or the Bushes in the United States. We can talk about traditional legitimacy in the United States through rules and regulations. The U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. These are sacred documents in the religion of American civil society. Amen. So in sum, legitimacy is central to stateness. Let's give you some quick phrases here. Traditional legitimacy, think of ritual and continuity. Charismatic legitimacy, let's think of ideas embodied in a leader, or think of charisma. And rational legal legitimacy, think of laws and rules. So legitimacy is important because it makes it possible for a state to carry out its will and its functions. Without legitimacy, individuals will ignore political expectations, things like paying taxes, following regulations, fighting for the state, in war, would be difficult to get done. If those things aren't done, the state's last option is the threat of force. Do you ever notice that in the past, the United States used to have to conscript or enslave people into the army? Today, the military establishment in the United States has such legitimacy that it's a volunteer army. And still, it can wage war in many countries at once. The state's last option outside of consent is force. However, those states who use force often tend to be weakly institutionalized. It's kind of a dog who knows what to do, is obedient, and just kind of does what the owner does without like a threat or anything, just because he knows what the owner wants done and he does it. That's kind of like a very institutionalized legitimacy. A dog who does not know what to do or does not follow the whims of the owner and is just constantly punished, that is kind of like a state who needs to use force to institutionalize its legitimacy, and that can't last very long before the dog gets confused and just gives up, or just bites the hand that feeds him. So it's difficult in non-legitimized states to get the public to willingly and blindly comply to what the state wants. Another way to think about power and to compare power among states is through levels of centralization or decentralization. Among countries, there are different distributions of power. These are not hard and fast rules. However, I mentioned in the first lecture that individual freedom tends to be associated with decentralization, and collective equality tends to be associated with centralization. Again, tends to be. These are not hard and fast rules. And when we're talking about decentralization, we're often talking about federalism. A federal state is that state where power is devolved to regional and or local bodies, and that is listed in a constitution. That power takes the form of the power of taxation, of lawmaking, of security. The United States, Canada, India, these are all federal states who have subnational bodies who carry out their own powers. These powers are defined in a constitution, because we're going to talk about the UK, and the UK is a unitary state. However, it does have many sub-regional bodies like Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales, who you might think, well, that might be a federal state. However, it's not really embodied in their constitution, even though their constitution is unwritten, but it's not embodied in the constitution and not assumed to be their powers. Those powers that are given to those separate sub-regional bodies is devolved or given explicitly to them by the parliament. Anyway, back to federal states. Germany is another one. It has Länder. Those are basically their version of American states. The assumption within federalism is that local interests can be presented better, and they can also check the growth of centralized power within their countries. Within federalism, also, we can think about symmetric versus asymmetric federalism. Symmetric federalism is like the United States, where each state has the same powers that the federal government, the central government, gives it. Asymmetric federalism is where the powers are not evenly divided among subnational bodies. Asymmetric federalism exists in Spain and Russia and India, where some states are more privileged than other states. Some states have more powers of taxation and in delegating authority and making laws and security than other states. Asymmetric federalism tends to exist in countries where there are harsh ethnic divisions. So in Spain, for example, in Catalonia, there's a severe nationalist bent in the region. That's the region where Barcelona is. So that they typically will give those regions where there's ethnic power more powers as a way of appeasing them into not basically seceding from the country. The other type of state that is not a federal state is called a unitary state. A unitary state is where power is concentrated at the national level. In unitary states, the central government is responsible for most areas of policy. Territorial divisions within the country have less of an impact on political power, like in China and Japan and France, the UK that I mentioned before. The assumption here in unitary states is that local interests can be represented without recourse to regional political institutions. Federalism, unitary states might believe, people who are proponents of unitary states might think, may weaken state efficiency by dispersing power among too many competing authorities. In recent years, there's been a tendency toward decentralization in unitary states, and decentralization from the central government is called devolution. So to increase state legitimacy by moving political power closer to the people, many central governments will devolve power. It can also be to resolve ethnic and religious differences and to give local powers to regions. In 2005, Iraq became a federal state, and of course after enduring the American occupation. Nepal abolished its monarchy in 2007 and drew up a federal constitution in 2015. Oftentimes, devolution does not mean outright federalism. However, there's still significant power that is given downward from the central government. And in the UK, again, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, more recently, that has been the case. The next group of ways that we can think of comparing power in states, or legitimacy in states, is, is through thinking of states as being either strong or weak, through state capacity, and through state autonomy. So let's start with the difference between strong states and weak states. So what is the difference between a strong and a weak state? A strong state is that which is able to fulfill basic tasks, such as defending its territory, making and enforcing rules and rights, collecting taxes, managing the economy. A weak state, on the other hand, cannot execute these tasks very well. It applies rules unevenly. It has high rates of tax evasion and other public non-compliance. There are often armed rivals to the state controlling some territory. There are rebel movements or organized crime or simply other states claiming territory. There's often high levels of corruption, and there is very low levels of economic development. In addition, weak states are often not well institutionalized. They lack authority and legitimacy. And in the extreme case, state structures in weak states completely break down. And those weak states are extreme, and we call them fragile or a failed state. And examples of those are like Afghanistan or Somalia or Sudan or South Sudan, Yemen. So building on this idea of strong versus weak states are the ideas of state capacity and autonomy. State capacity is the ability of the state to wield power to carry out basic tasks. These basic tasks are like security, reconciling freedom and equality, enacting fundamental policies, and low capacity states cannot do these things very effectively. High capacity requires organization, legitimacy, effective leadership. Things get done. Roads get paved, schools get built, regulations are created and followed, and lawbreakers are punished. Autonomy. A little bit of a different term here. Autonomy is the ability of the state to wield power independently of the public or other international actors. Policies can be carried out without having to consult the public or worry about strong opposition or a threat to overturn it. So states with high autonomy can largely claim to act on behalf of the public and to do what it thinks is in the best interest of this country, irrespective of public opinion. A state with low autonomy often acts at the behest of private individuals, of groups, of other states, and maybe of interest groups. It is less able to disobey public will or the demands of well-organized groups. So there are different combinations of both capacity and autonomy. And if you are just a little bit good at your math class, you might think, boy, there are 4 different combinations that we can have of capacity, low and high capacity, and low and high autonomy. Well, you are correct. So let's look at those combinations. A state that is high in capacity and high in autonomy can execute major policies easily. One great example is China. China. In China, it can implement and lay out its infrastructure pretty easily, even though it comes at great expense, to a financial expense, and also at the expense of individual freedom. So it can, build the roads, rails, dams, even though it costs a whole lot, and it can pretty much usurp territory and take people's property for that greater good that the Chinese state believes. A state that is in high capacity and low autonomy has widespread powers, but is subject to public intervention. Two great examples, the United States and Canada. Individual freedom is relatively speaking, pretty good. Pretty good. In these states, individuals and the public can constrain central authority and hinder national policy making. Two more to go. States that are in low capacity but high autonomy. These states lack the ability to enact policies effectively, but if they could, they would do so without limits to that power. Russia, great example. In the last 10 years, Russian power became more centralized and more autonomous. So the Russian state under Putin can enact policies without regard really to public backlash. However, it's not very good at doing that. So it's really without the capacity to successfully enforce regulations. So Russia is a good example. Venezuela, more recently under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. The last category, those states with low capacity and low autonomy. These are states that face heavy backlash when it tries to do things, and when it tries to do things, it's not very good at doing it. These are often lesser developed countries. They are often captured, quote unquote, by elites and ethnic and religious groups. They are unable to fulfill important national tasks like economic development and ensuring public education, building roads, infrastructure, etc., etc., etc. We can think of states in sub-Saharan Africa. We can think of lesser developed countries in Asia, South Asia, in South America, and just poor countries overall. They have poor legitimacy. So we can understand these concepts, and it's good to understand these concepts to better realize what states are and are not able to do and why. So our closing comments here, let's conclude with some questions to consider, to think about going forward. Why are some states more centralized or decentralized? Why do they have more or less capacity or autonomy? Some of these answers lie in history. Some of them are a result of international threats and intervention. There are also cultural norms regarding freedom and equality that are different. Is there an ideal mix of different forms of legitimacy, centralization, autonomy, and capacity? So think about those questions. And that is all for this lecture.